Yes, a very short background. We've had lots of standards for electronic invoicing around in Europe and around the globe. There are international standards available since many, many years. Since late 80s and in the 90s, e-invoicing was common, but there is a lack of European standards for how to use e-invoicing in Europe with VAT and with the European legislation. So we have these generic international standards, but no specific standard for Europe. And this has been a problem, particularly if you want to use e-invoicing, if you refer to e-invoicing or invoicing standards in your legislation or in your contract, then you want to refer to some formal standard and not something that you invented on your own. So that is one reason why we now have this European standard, and we also have had in the background very different ambition levels and different solutions around Europe, which made the inner market not functioning as good as it could work. So the directive sets minimum requirements for the contracting authorities and for the countries. One thing that is important is from the directive, from the preamble, it says that the benefits of electronic invoicing are maximized when the generation, the sending, the transmission, the reception, and the processing of an invoice can be fully automated. So that is like a vision. And it also says that a mere image file or it should not be considered to be an electronic invoice for the purpose of this directive. I'll come back to that in a moment. So we already seen this phrase, it's from Article 7. The contracting authorities must be able to receive and process electronic invoices according to this new European standard. And that's partly what I'm going to talk about now. The dates we also got introduced. The standard was developed and published on the 17th of October 2017. It was a very tight deadline to create a European standard in the deadline that was given to SEN from the European Commission. But it managed to do it, and 18th April 2018, then it's the time when you are to comply to the new legislation, or with the 12-month extension for subcentral entities. So this is something that you already know, of course. On the implementation of the directive, as we already heard Cornelis talking about, there can be different ways of transposing the directive into national law. Some countries are implementing the directive as is. That seems to be like a strategy or policy in many countries to not go further, to just follow the directive as is. Meaning, in the case of this directive, that the public entities must be able to receive invoices based on contracts that are above threshold, and nothing more, really. So that many countries are doing this. Some countries are also adding some type of policy or other types of regulations saying that when making a call for tender, you must have a contractual statement that e-invoicing is mandatory under this contract. So that is a way of, the legislation is still as is, but you add a policy that you make it more well used. So, and this is also what's happening in the Netherlands, if I understand it correctly from Cornelis. But then we have also a handful of countries that takes the directive and transpose it into a much more strict, way, where the requirement is put on the suppliers. So they must send electronic invoices. They are not allowed to use paper anymore. And we have countries like Italy, Croatia, Denmark, and Sweden as a handful. I think there are a few more, Spain and perhaps a few more. That puts this requirement. So electronic invoices becomes mandatory. That's a very easy way. You don't have to think about onboarding your suppliers very much because they have to send electronic invoices, otherwise they are not following the law. I will tell you a little bit more about the Swedish use case after the break. Of course, which approach you chose must be based on the maturity and how well known the e-invoicing is in the country, and how well it will be possible to live up to the legislation. In the case of Denmark and Sweden, we've had e-invoicing for quite a long time, so the directive didn't really add anything to us, because everybody could receive already. So, okay. So, in retrospect now, what do we mean by e-invoicing in the context of the directive? One, it must be formatted and structured so that it can be efficiently processed. It has to be issued, transmitted, and received electronically, and it has to follow the European standard. This rules out paper invoices which are scanned by the receiver. Okay, it sounds silly perhaps, but when I talk to municipalities in Sweden, they say, yeah, we do e-invoicing. We handle all our invoices electronically because we scan them when we receive them. So all our users, they are approving their invoices electronically. Okay, but the invoice itself was a paper invoice. It wasn't issued, transmitted, and received electronically. So even though it might seem obvious, but paper invoices are not considered to be electronic. Also PDF invoices, and this is perhaps more of a surprise. If you ask particularly the supplier side, so how many of you do send electronic invoices? Almost everybody says, yeah, we do that. Many of our customers demand that we send them PDF invoices through email. Okay, but that's not e-invoices in the context of the directive. So that is more of a surprise, I think, for suppliers who think they are ready, but actually they're not. They have to have more capabilities to create these structured invoices according to the European standard. So, looking at these steps, the generation, the transmission, and the reception, I'm going to follow this flow now in an upcoming slides. I'll first look at how an invoice can be generated electronically, how it can be transmitted, and how it can be processed. And then I will also say a little bit about some advices that I have from my experiences on how to think about how to use references in an invoice and how to communicate with your suppliers. So it will be a bit practical, but a little bit digging into the technology a bit. So for the generation of the invoice, there are many options available for the suppliers. One option is that they create the electronic invoice directly in their ERP system or in their invoicing system, directly to the European standard in that format. Of course, it requires that their ERP system is prepared for that and has that capability. Many ERP systems can create an electronic invoice file, but in some kind of internal format. So it has to be transformed to the European standard. But that's also an option. But there are also alternatives where the supplier are using some kind of web portal or e-invoicing tool online to key in their invoice, and then the invoice is sent electronically. So that is a kind of a double step. They have to issue the invoice in their ERP system, and then they have to key it in a portal. But that's a way of handling, particularly for small suppliers with not that big volumes of invoices. That can be an option. Another quite common solution is something called virtual printer or printer capture. That means that you install a software and that acts as a virtual printer. So when you are printing an invoice, you're not choosing your physical printer on the desk. You're choosing this virtual printer. And then when it's printed, the information in the invoice is sent to a software which creates an electronic invoice and sends it. So that's a way of overbridging some older systems that then can go through this printer capture solution. So and these are a few alternatives. There are many service providers out there who can help suppliers in building this capability. So we have referred to the standard, and Georg will go into a little bit more detail of what the European standard actually covers. What it doesn't cover is how to transport, how to send the invoice. It describes how the invoice should be formatted, the file format and the meaning of the business terms, but not how to send it. And also the directive doesn't say anything about how to connect with your suppliers. It only says you must be able to receive. It doesn't say how. So if I would say, is it allowed to send invoices on USB pins with bicycles or on a floppy disk by mail? Yeah, it doesn't say anything about it. Of course, there are a lot of bad ideas here, but this is, of course, a very big challenge for particularly the suppliers. If the buyers, the public entities around Europe, decides on completely different modes of receiving their invoices, that would become a challenge. And we're talking sometimes about the four-corner model. I will dig into a little bit deeper into what we mean by four-corner model. I've heard it 3 or 4 times today. How many here have an understanding of what four-corner model is compared to the three-corner model? A few? Yeah? Good. But most didn't raise their hands. So that's good for me, because then I'm not wasting your time. Both the four-corner model and the three-corner model means that you have a service provider. Someone is helping you. A third party is acting on your behalf in exchanging the invoice for you. So they are taking care of the technical aspects. The three-corner model essentially means that both the buyer and seller must use the same service provider. And then the two-corner model, that's when you have direct communication with your supplier, and that's not very scalable. So I will look into more now on the four-corner model. So this is what it can seem for a supplier. I even heard an American company who sent electronic invoices to their European customers, and they had to keep track of 200 different portals, username and passwords, and these portals often with, not in English even, the user interface, where they had to log in every month to key in their invoices. That's a lot of wasted time. So it can be complicated if you are acting on many markets. The four-corner model can be described like this. We have the supplier and the customers up here, and then we have service providers. The invoice is created at the supplier side in his ERP system, is handed over to the service provider. The service provider is sending it to the receiver's service provider, who is then forwarding it to the customer's eInvoicing management system. So in all simplicity, this is how it works. And the corner 1, the corner 2, the corner 3, and corner 4. So these are the corners in the four-corner model. It's sometimes a bit hard. Today, with cloud systems and complex IT solutions, we are not necessarily owning our own systems anymore and having them in the basement on premise with your own IT staff taking care of it. You even may have your ERP system or accounting system as a service online. So to have a service provider providing IT services is something that is very common. So in here now, in these slides, I'm particularly referring to service providers as e-invoicing service providers, even if your ERP system may also be provided by a service provider. So a typical tools that you have is the supplier has an ERP system, the customer have a workflow system for handling his invoices, or accounting system, and so on. The service providers in the context of e-invoices typically can provide functionality such as conversion between different formats, validation that the invoice is correct according to the standard, that it complies to the standard. Archiving can be a function or a service which is provided here. Notifications, if something goes wrong, you get a message. They take care of the technical exchange and addressing and keeping track of where should all invoices be sent, depending on who the receiver is. These are typical functionality that e-invoicing service providers have in their portfolio. Not necessarily that you will use all of them, but this is something that they often can offer. And when sending an invoice, said before, the ERP system are not always prepared to produce invoices in the European standard format. They can produce it in a flat file or an in-house file, but that has to be transformed into the correct structure. And that conversion or transformation can be done by the service provider who sends the electronic invoice according to the European standard to the receiving service provider. And on that side, it's not uncommon that they translate it to a format that your ERP system can handle. So this is an absolutely okay solution. What's important to remember here is that okay, something has happened with this slide. Sorry about that. The green thing that popped up there is supposed to cover all the way down. What I'm trying to explain here is that the service provider, corner 2, is acting on behalf of the supplier, and the corner 3 is acting on behalf of the customer. So what that means is that the moment the invoice is received by you is when it's received by the service provider. It's never in a limbo where it's not either the customers, the suppliers, or the customers. So they are acting on behalf of you. You have outsourced this functionality. And this is important to remember because often you think that what we receive is this file that we get converted to our format that our ERP system handles. But now with the directive, it becomes clear that this is what is the European standard, and this is the moment of reception. So when interchanging the invoice, if we look now, I will introduce PEPL, the PEPL infrastructure in a moment. So just look at how it traditionally worked with the four-corner model. So we have all these suppliers and the buyers, and they have chosen different service providers. And when this supplier, pointing to one in the middle there, he is sending his invoice through his service provider to a specific buyer. And this is happening all the time. Everybody is sending invoices through their service providers. This works well, but particularly as a public entity, sometimes you need to renew your contracts. You might end up with a new eInvoicing service provider. Perhaps 4 years, 8 years after the framework that you have now in Ireland, you will have new service providers. And what will happen then? So this buyer down here, he has a new service providers, but the invoices will continue to flow the old way to your old service provider. This has happened in so many cases, and we've had big issues with this in Sweden, where we had to handle all these invoices that were addressed incorrectly. Because all this onboarding and all these configurations were made statically. So there is no automatic way of finding out where the receiver is and behind which service provider is this specific municipality. So it was something that was configured as when you set up the connection. And then it was like that, static, until someone changed it. So that means also that if you have then 1,000 suppliers connected, and then you change service provider, you need to reach out to all those 1,000 suppliers and ask them, please, you have to inform your service provider that we have changed. And this is, if you compare to mobile phone, if I will get your phone number, I don't really have to think about which provider is you using. I just need your phone number. That's how it works in mobile phone and in 4G and GSM. But that's not how it used to work within eInvoicing. Okay, so it was really cumbersome and it was expensive to build up all these onboardings. Now, let's put PEPL into this puzzle here. We have heard already the concept of an access point to PEPL. So when we introduce PEPL to these service providers, they will have an additional functionality. They are also access point providers, not only service providers, but they also have access point functionality. And in PEPL, we also have an addressing mechanism. From a functional perspective, you can see it as an address book. So each receiver in PEPL if you can receive invoices, you have to be registered in this address book in Peppol. So the buyer here, he's registered. So his access point has registered him in this address book. And the supplier, he sends his invoice. The access point makes a lookup. So he checks the address book. So where should I send this invoice? And in the address book, it says that this particular buyer is using that access point. So the invoice can be sent and forwarded. And let's say now again that we have to change service provider. So yeah, like this. So the last buyer there, he has now a new service provider. He then just have to update the address book, and the invoices will automatically be routed correctly, momentarily. No invoices continuing to be sent to your old service provider. This is a very important aspect of the Peppol infrastructure. And one question that comes up here is, of course, then, how do I identify myself? I took the example with the phone number. The phone number is easy, it's just a short number. How do I identify myself as a receiver in Peppol? And then we have something called Peppol identifiers, or participant identifiers. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. In this four-corner model, we see that the access point, they are here. So when it's received when it reaches the access point. So again, so back to the Peppol identifiers. Typically, you use your organization number or your VAT number as your particular, your specific identifier in Peppol. Good idea is to use an identifier that is easy to explain and which is a concept that the supplier has knowledge of. So if you use your VAT number, for example, as your identifier, that is something that you easily can say to your suppliers that please send invoices through Peppol to us. Our Peppol ID is our VAT number. I just said that sentence with words that most suppliers would understand. Okay, the Peppol, that was new, but okay, but I can send through Peppol, and the VAT number is your identifier, so that's your phone number in Peppol. It's pretty simple. Going back 5-10 years, trying to explain to your suppliers how to send electronic invoices, you had to talk about which formats are you using, which service providers are you using, do they actually work together, and it's so many technical aspects that needed to be agreed. But now it's enough to just say, this is our Peppol ID, and send invoices that way. And to give you an example, I've taken two authorities from Sweden. It's University of Gothenburg and the Coast Guard. And looking at their websites, the first, in the case of Gothenburg, they have a letter which they send to all their suppliers, and they publish it on the website too. And they say that our suppliers can send invoices via Peppol, and then our Peppol ID is, and here comes the number. And that is the organization number of University of Gothenburg. And for the Coast Guard, they say that they prefer the Peppol to be the method for receiving electronic invoices, and their Peppol ID is this and that. So it becomes similar to the postal address, but this is the electronic address. The supplier doesn't have to know more than that. So looking at an invoice, we have information like the buyer and the delivery location. We have lots of identifiers in the invoice. You have party identifiers. We sometimes even have specific numbers for the delivery locations in an organization. Some big organizations, they use the GS1 system for that. But so there is room for a number of these data elements in the European standard, but we also have this Peppol ID, electronic address identifier, which has a specific location in the invoice. It has to be provided in the invoice. And also, it's provided in the envelope. There is actually an envelope also for electronic invoices. The And the PEPL ID is stated in this electronic envelope for the receiver and the sender. And the PEPL ID typically looks like this. You have a 4-digit prefix and then your actual number. 007 means Swedish organization number. You have a similar number for Irish VAT numbers. And this is then the actual identifier. So this becomes my mobile phone number in PEPL e-delivery network. So there are many access points in PEPL, over 200. We have many Irish access points. A supplier can essentially choose whichever he wants, depending on their requirements and their solution. So the situation which Cornelis mentioned before, where there was like this a hen and the egg situation, where there are no services available, but and no one dares to put requirements on electronic invoices until there are services, but the service providers, they are not really going to innovate or invest until someone is requiring. You know. But now we are not in that situation. There is a good competition and a lot of different solutions for most suppliers, if not all. So that was about how the invoice is exchanged, how it's sent to the receiver. Just a few words about when you received it. This depends on your system capabilities, how you're going to handle your invoice electronically. I've seen some nightmare strategies in Europe where the receivers say that the only thing the directive says is that we must comply, able to receive invoices which comply. If we then print the invoice and handle it as any other printed invoice, paper invoice, it doesn't matter because it was issued, sent, and received electronically. So we will print our invoices. And of course, that will not create any benefit, and it's just a big waste, I would say. So a good strategy on how to work with the invoice electronically in your process, in your system, that is an important part. We're talking about two main strategies. To have a workflow so that the invoice is automatically directed to the one who did the purchase, so that that person can do an assessment of the invoice. Did I do this purchase? Did I get the goods? Okay. And then after that, the invoice can be approved, perhaps by his boss or something. And then after that, it can be sent in for accounting and payment. So that is a workflow which automates the management of the invoice. For a big portion of the invoices, perhaps up to 60–70%, you can also go further to have straight through processing. For invoices, telecom invoices, energy, typically anything that is on subscription, then you can configure business rules that say that if the mobile phone bill is below 50 euros, then it will be automatically accepted. Some even said that they have rules like the invoice must be above 30 euros, and that way we will find any subscription which isn't used. So the municipalities finding hundreds of phone subscriptions that no one really used. So that's a good way of picking that up. So, and also for ordering, if you have an electronic order, you can, in the invoice, refer to that order and have a more automatic matching. I don't know the details of the framework and the suppliers in Ireland and how much of this functionality they provide or how much, how advanced they are. Perhaps we can come back to that. So, of course, the invoice is in its electronic form. It's a structured file, but it's presented. It looks like any paper invoice. It's a bit of a change how to work with this, because all invoices will have the same layout. When you used to see invoices from different suppliers have, of course, depending on how they are printing them, but they have the different layouts, but now all invoices will have essentially the same layout. This sometimes in the beginning, people saw this as a drawback, because they like to see the logo type, they like to see this. But after a while, my experience is that most users, they like it because they know exactly where to find the references, where to find the amounts, and it's always the same, so it just makes it easier to handle. And looking at the invoice in more detail, up in the corner, this is just one layout that can be used. We have the order reference and the buyer reference. At least one of these two must be provided when using PEPL for the European standard. The buyer reference is a reference to like your contact or your reference in the invoice, typically. The one who in the workflow is going to be handling the invoice. Or order reference, that is if you have an order which you're referring to for automatic matching. So with that, some takeaways. I think it's important to think from a supplier perspective. Keep the message simple. You are going to events like this, and you have people to ask, but the suppliers, that they are so many, and they will not spend much time building up knowledge around e-invoicing. So the message to them must be very, very simple. PEPL provides a one-stop shop for this, so if they use PEPL, then they will comply to the European and that makes it easy for them. So that is a simple message. And also, already from the beginning, plan for large-scale usage. Think in a scenario where all your suppliers will send electronic invoices. It will happen in a number of years in the future. It will happen. Many countries, more and more countries, are going for mandatory electronic invoicing. And when you have already the capability, and there are so many suppliers that have the capability, why not then just go to 100%? So already from the beginning, think in those with that scenario in mind, and don't consider each onboarding to be a project of its own, because then it will not be scalable enough.